The evening was flawless. Held at Azure, Manhattan's most exclusive rooftop restaurant, it was the kind of reservation that required not just wealth, but lineage. The kind of place where bloodlines opened doors that billions couldn't. Sandra Pierce, the 23-year-old heiress to a $700 million oil and gas empire, commanded the center table, her circle of trust fund socialites hanging on her every word. 60 floors below, the city glittered like scattered diamonds, but nothing sparkled quite like the crystal glass Sandra raised as she stood. "A toast," she announced, her voice carrying across the candlelit space with practiced confidence. A toast to people who know their worth. But what came next wasn't a toast. It was a death sentence. Sandra turned toward a man sitting alone in the corner. Someone who didn't belong. His suit was off the rack, his demeanor too quiet, too ordinary. With a smile that her friends would later caption, iconic, on their Instagram stories, Sandra walked over and tilted her glass. Ice water cascaded over his head in slow motion as phones came out to capture every second. Her friends erupted in laughter, champagne glasses raised in celebration of the performance. The kind of cruelty that Manhattan's elite had perfected into an art form. But the biggest shock wasn't the water dripping from his dark hair. It was what the quiet man did next. Nothing. He simply stood, water streaming down his tailored collar, and looked at each of them. Not with anger. Not with embarrassment. With something far more terrifying, recognition. His eyes moved across their faces like a camera recording evidence, memorizing every laugh, every phone held up, every smile. Then he placed cash on his table, turned, and walked toward the exit. No scene. No threats. No reaction at all. Because Alex Volkov didn't need to respond. The countdown had already started. You just watched a wealthy socialite pour water on a stranger while her friends laughed and filmed it for content. If that makes your blood boil, if watching someone treat another human being like entertainment disgusts you, then don't just keep scrolling. Hit that subscribe button right now. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching this from. Because what happens next is going to prove that geography doesn't matter, wealth doesn't matter, and social status definitely doesn't matter when karma catches up. Sandra and her friends thought consequences were for other people. Let's watch them learn otherwise. Now let me tell you who Sandra Pierce really was, and who she was about to become. The world knew Sandra Pierce as Manhattan's golden girl, the daughter of Richard and Catherine Pierce, owners of Pierce Energy Solutions, a $700 million oil and gas conglomerate with offshore drilling operations stretching from the Gulf Coast to the North Atlantic, pipeline networks that snaked across 12 states, and refinery contracts that powered half the eastern seaboard. With 3.1 million Instagram followers, Sandra documented every moment of her charmed life. Private jets to Paris Fashion Week, yacht parties in the Hamptons with celebrities and influencers, designer wardrobes that cost more than most people's annual salaries. She was untouchable, invincible, immune to the consequences that governed ordinary people's lives. Or so she believed. But they didn't know Alex Volkov, the man in the unremarkable suit sitting alone in the corner. The man who controlled the permits that kept oil flowing through pipelines. The man who held quiet relationships with every regulator who could shut down a refinery with a single signature. The man who knew every politician, union boss, infrastructure operator, and environmental inspector on the East Coast by their first name. The man who existed in that shadowy space where legitimate business and untouchable influence merged into something far more powerful than either. The man who would dismantle the Pierce empire in 10 weeks without raising his voice, without making a single threat, without breaking a single law. The man who just smiled, wiped ice water from his face, and walked away. Because Alex Volkov understood something Sandra Pierce had never learned, something her parents had never taught her, something her wealth had allowed her to ignore her entire life. In the energy business, power isn't about who owns the oil. Power is about who controls where it flows. And Alex Volkov controlled every valve, every permit, every relationship, every invisible thread that kept the Pierce empire running. Sandra had just cut all of those threads with one glass of ice water. She just didn't know it yet. The Lamborghini was totaled. Again, Sandra Pierce stood on Fifth Avenue at 3 a.m., her phone angled to capture the crumpled front end of the Urus, the second one this year. "Guys, so this just happened," she narrated to her 3.1 million followers, her voice carrying that practiced blend of mock distress and genuine amusement. "Dad's going to kill me." She wasn't worried. Dad never killed her. Dad just called the insurance company, paid the deductible, and ordered a replacement by morning. By the time the flatbed arrived, Sandra was already in a private car heading back to the penthouse, scrolling through comments. "Spoiled Princess" had 18,000 likes. She screenshot it and posted it to her story with 3 crown emojis. The penthouse sprawled across the top 3 floors of a pre-war building overlooking Central Park. 8,400 square feet of marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows, and the kind of casual luxury that only generational wealth could buy. Her mother, Catherine Pierce, was already awake when Sandra walked in at dawn, reviewing foundation portfolios for her various charity boards. She glanced up from her tablet as her daughter passed, designer heels dangling from one hand. "Another car?" Catherine asked, not really asking. Sandra shrugged. "The driver cut me off." Catherine returned to her screen. The Museum of Energy Innovation needed a keynote speaker for their spring gala. Important people to impress, connections to maintain. Her daughter's vehicular carelessness barely registered on the scale of things that mattered. By noon, Sandra was at Teterboro Airport, boarding the family's Gulfstream G650 for Paris Fashion Week. She filmed everything: the cream leather seats, the catered lunch from Daniel, the skyline disappearing beneath them. Her personal assistant, Maria, sat in the back, virtually invisible, managing Sandra's calendar on 3 devices simultaneously. Sandra had never once asked Maria her last name. In 2 years of employment, she'd never bothered to learn where Maria lived, whether she had children, what her life looked like beyond the 18-hour days she spent managing Sandra's. Richard Pierce built his empire the way his father and grandfather had, by understanding that energy was currency, that whoever controlled the flow of oil controlled the future. Pierce Energy Solutions started with offshore drilling rights Richard's grandfather secured in the 1960s, expanded into pipeline networks his father monopolized in the 80s, and exploded into a $700 million conglomerate under Richard's ruthless acquisition strategy. Refineries in Louisiana and Texas. Pipeline infrastructure from Houston to Newark. Offshore platforms dotting the Gulf Coast like industrial lighthouses. And he'd given his daughter everything. The penthouse, the cars, the black card with no limit. The life where consequences were theoretical concepts that applied to other people. He called it confidence. Catherine called it breeding. The world called it what it was. Entitlement so pure it had calcified into cruelty. Sandra posted from Paris. Front row at Chanel. Champagne at the Plaza Athénée. A midnight yacht party on the Seine where the champagne cost more than most people earned in a month. Her followers multiplied. Brands sent gifts. Invitations arrived daily. She had no idea that in 10 days at Azure Restaurant, she would make a decision that would cost her everything. Azure was impossible. Not expensive impossible. Wealthy people understood expensive. Impossible impossible. The kind of restaurant where the waiting list stretched 18 months and money meant nothing without the right connections. Sandra's reservation came through Catherine's charity network, called in as a favor from a board member who owed the Pierce family for a particularly generous donation during an inconvenient audit. She arrived with 5 friends, all trust fund socialites who measured their worth in follower counts and family legacy. They claimed the center table like conquering royalty, champagne flowing before menus arrived. The city glittered 60 floors below, Manhattan spread out like a kingdom they'd inherited by birthright. Olivia Chun was filming everything for her stories. Marcus Whitmore, heir to a commercial real estate empire, kept checking his engagement rates. Veronica Ashford ordered the most expensive wine on the list just to photograph the bottle. They were performing wealth, documenting excess, turning privilege into content. That's when Sandra noticed him. Corner table, alone, reading something on his phone like he was sitting in a diner instead of Manhattan's most exclusive rooftop. His suit was decent but unremarkable. The kind you'd find at a mid-tier department store, not bespoke Italian tailoring. No entourage, no obvious wealth markers, no reason to be there. Who let that guy in here? Sandra said, loud enough for surrounding tables to hear. Her friends turned, following her gaze. Olivia angled her phone toward the stranger. Seriously, Marcus laughed. Is he someone's accountant? The sommelier approaching their table actually flinched. Something flickered across his face, recognition, maybe fear, but Sandra didn't notice. She was already standing, ice water in hand, inspiration striking the way it always did when she knew she had an audience. "Watch this," she told her friends and walked toward the corner table. Alex Volkov didn't look up. Not when her shadow fell across his table. Not when she stopped directly in front of him. Not until she spoke. "Excuse me," Sandra said, her voice carrying that particular Manhattan inflection that turned politeness into condescension. "I think you're in the wrong restaurant. There's a cheesecake factory 2 blocks south." His eyes lifted then. Dark, calm, assessing. He didn't respond. The silence should have been a warning. The stillness should have registered as danger. But Sandra only saw an audience, a moment, an opportunity for content that would go viral. She tilted the glass. Ice water cascaded over his head in a crystal stream, soaking his hair, his collar, his unremarkable suit jacket. Her friends erupted behind her. Laughter, gasps, phones raised to capture every second. Olivia was filming in portrait mode, already composing the caption. Marcus was literally applauding. Alex Volkov set down his phone. Slowly, methodically, he stood, water dripping from his dark hair onto the white tablecloth. He didn't speak, didn't shout, didn't even look angry. He simply looked at Sandra, then at each of her friends, his gaze moving across their faces with the precision of a camera photographing evidence for later use. Then he pulled out his wallet, placed $300 bills on the water-soaked table, and walked toward the exit. His shoes left wet prints on the marble floor. The restaurant had gone completely silent. Sandra returned to her table, triumphant. "Did you get it?" she asked Olivia. "Every second," Olivia confirmed, already editing. None of them noticed the maitre d' immediately retreating to his office, phone in hand, trembling. None of them wondered why the sommelier looked like he might be sick. None of them questioned why the other diners had suddenly found their plates fascinating. They ordered another bottle of champagne and celebrated their content. By the time they left 3 hours later, Olivia's video had 47,000 views. The countdown had started. They just didn't know it yet. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning. Richard Pierce read it 3 times, his coffee going cold in his hand. Texas Pipeline Authority. Permit TX, 4477 and J denied. The expansion project they'd been building toward for 18 months. The $180 million infrastructure investment that would connect their Gulf Coast refineries to Northeast markets, dead in the water. Unforeseen environmental compliance issues require immediate reassessment, the official language read. Corporate speak for nothing. No specifics, no timeline for appeal, no explanation. Richard's chief operations officer, David Martinez, stood in the doorway looking like he'd aged 5 years overnight. "Sir, I've called Austin 6 times. Nobody's returning my calls. The permits office says the decision is final pending further review." "Further review of what?" "We passed every inspection. We have documentation." "They know. They don't care." Richard had built his empire understanding that permits were negotiations, that regulatory compliance was a dance between legal requirements and strategic relationships. You didn't just lose an $180 million project overnight. Not unless someone wanted you to. By Thursday, Continental Power and Energy sent their termination notice. 12 years of supplying natural gas to their Northeast Corridor operations. Contracts worth $140 million annually gone. The letter cited strategic realignment of supplier partnerships and evolving corporate values regarding environmental stewardship. Richard knew Marcus Brennan, Continental's CEO. They'd golfed together last month. Their families vacationed in the same circles. "Get Marcus on the phone," Richard told his assistant. Marcus didn't take the call, or the next 4. His office offered increasingly creative excuses. International conference, board meetings, family emergency. The message was clear. Whatever relationship they'd had was over, and Marcus wasn't interested in explaining why. Catherine's call came Friday afternoon. She was crying, something Richard had witnessed maybe twice in 30 years of marriage. The Museum of Energy Innovation Board, the institution she'd chaired for 8 years, the charity she'd raised $40 million for, had requested her immediate resignation. "They said my presence creates reputational challenges for the organization," she said, her voice breaking. Eleanor Harrison delivered the message herself. "We've been friends for 15 years, Richard." She couldn't even look at me. That evening, Richard sat in his home office surrounded by termination notices, permit denials, and politely worded rejections that all arrived within 72 hours of each other. 3 unrelated problems. Different agencies, different companies, different sectors. No common thread. Except there was. His corporate intelligence team found it buried in scheduling records and meeting logs. The Texas Pipeline Authority supervisor who denied their permit had received a visit from an infrastructure consultant 2 days before the decision. Marcus Brennan's calendar showed a breakfast meeting with the same consultant 3 days before Continental's termination notice. Eleanor Harrison's assistant logged a phone call from someone matching the same description the morning before Catherine's board requested her resignation. The consultant's name appeared in all 3 instances, flagged by Richard's research team as a person of interest. Alex Volkov. Richard stared at the name. It meant nothing to him. Not yet. Richard hired Donovan's strategic intelligence on Monday morning. They specialized in the kind of research that never appeared in official reports. The connections that mattered, the relationships that moved industries, the power structures that existed in handshakes rather than contracts. The preliminary report arrived in 48 hours. Alex Volkov owned 14 legitimate businesses across the eastern seaboard. Infrastructure consulting firms, logistics operations, regulatory compliance services, environmental assessment companies. He sat on advisory boards for 3 state energy commissions. His consulting practice had contracts with half the pipeline authorities between Texas and Maine. But the real information came buried in the margins. Volkov had relationships with permit office directors, environmental regulators, union bosses, port authority supervisors, politicians at state and federal levels. The kind of relationships that made things happen, or stopped them cold. Richard needed someone who understood that world. He called Vincent Moretti, a former energy sector executive who'd navigated the same regulatory landscape for 30 years before retiring to consulting. They met at a steakhouse in Midtown, far from anywhere the financial press might notice. Vincent looked sick when Richard mentioned the name. Jesus Christ, Richard. What did you do? I don't know what you're talking about. Alex Volkov doesn't just move in energy infrastructure. He is energy infrastructure. Vincent leaned forward, voice dropping. Every permit your company needs, every environmental clearance, every regulatory approval, every union negotiation. Those don't happen because of paperwork. They happen because people make them happen. Inspectors who look the other way. Regulators who expedite approvals. Politicians who smooth over complications. Volkov knows all of them. More than knows, he owns the relationships. He's a consultant. He's the foundation your entire industry is built on, and you're just realizing it exists. Vincent's scotch trembled in his hand. When your pipeline permit gets approved in 6 weeks instead of 6 months, that's Volkov making a phone call. When your refinery passes inspection despite borderline compliance, that's Volkov ensuring the inspector knows which details matter. When your offshore drilling rights get renewed without federal interference, that's Volkov maintaining relationships you don't even know exist. Richard felt something cold settle in his chest. And if he stops, then every favor, every expedited approval, every blind eye turns around and looks directly at you. Vincent stood, throwing cash on the table. Why are you asking about him, Richard? Richard pulled up his phone, found Olivia's Instagram video from Azure. Sandra pouring ice water on a man in a dark suit while her friends laughed. He showed Vincent the screen. Vincent went pale. When did this happen? 10 days ago. Then you're already finished. You just don't know it yet. Vincent grabbed his coat. Volkov doesn't get angry, Richard. He doesn't make threats. He just stops protecting you. And without his protection, companies like yours discover how fragile they really are. He left Richard sitting alone, staring at his daughter's face on the screen. Smiling, triumphant, pouring water on the man who controlled everything. The EPA arrived at dawn. Richard was still in his car when his phone exploded with calls from the Gulf Coast facility manager. Federal agents in tactical gear, search warrants, investigators swarming their Louisiana refinery like ants dismantling a carcass. They're pulling samples from systems we just upgraded, the manager said, his voice shaking. Sir, we passed full inspection 4 months ago. Everything was compliant. Everything had been compliant. Richard knew because he'd personally reviewed the certification documents. Because Pierce Energy had invested $12 million in environmental upgrades specifically to exceed federal standards. By noon, the EPA's preliminary findings leaked to Reuters. Contamination levels exceeding allowable limits. wastewater discharge violations, air quality monitoring systems allegedly tampered with. The language was carefully crafted. Alleged, potential, under investigation, but the damage was immediate. Pierce Energy's stock opened at $47 per share. By lunch, it hit $31. By market close, $21. 55% gone in 6 hours. $3 billion in market value evaporated while Richard sat in emergency board meetings watching institutional investors flee like rats abandoning a sinking vessel. His general counsel, Patricia Monroe, looked like she'd aged 10 years. Richard, the offshore drilling investigation just went public. Federal Safety Board is reviewing our entire Gulf platform operation. They're citing the incident from 2019, the one we settled quietly. The 2019 incident was nothing. A minor equipment failure, no injuries, resolved internally with updated protocols and a confidential settlement with regulators who agreed the violation was technical rather than substantive. It had cost Pierce Energy $800,000 and disappeared from public record. Until now, someone had resurrected the file, reframed the settlement as evidence of systemic safety failures, and delivered it to federal investigators with enough context to trigger a full-scale review. Every offshore platform Pierce Energy operated, 17 installations across the Gulf of Mexico, was now subject to immediate safety audits. Production halted pending compliance verification. Timeline indefinite. Catherine called at 4 o'clock. She'd stopped crying days ago, replaced by something harder, more brittle. Amanda Whitmore just canceled our dinner. We've been friends for 20 years, Richard. She said her husband's firm can't be associated with us right now. She actually used the word contamination, like we're toxic. They were toxic. Not chemically, legally, socially, financially. The kind of toxic that made politicians return campaign donations, made charity boards request resignations, made country club membership committees suddenly discover scheduling conflicts. That evening, Richard sat in his office watching CNBC run the story with Pierce Energy's logo filling the screen behind the anchor. Federal investigators probe safety violations at Pierce Energy facilities. Stock price collapses amid regulatory scrutiny. His phone buzzed. Text from board member Gerald Morrison. I'm resigning effective immediately. I'm sorry, Richard. 20 years on the board. Gone in 11 words. Richard pulled up the security footage his team had finally obtained from Azure Restaurant. He watched his daughter pour ice water on Alex Volkov. Watched Volkov stand, look at each of them, walk away. Vincent's words echoed. He just stops protecting you. Richard finally understood. Volkov hadn't planted violations or fabricated evidence. He'd simply removed his protection. And without it, every borderline compliance issue, every quietly settled incident, every regulatory favor that Pierce Energy had depended on for decades suddenly became visible. The empire wasn't being destroyed. It was being exposed for what it had always been. A house built on relationships they'd never bothered to maintain. Monday morning, Apex Refining Services sent the termination notice via courier. Not email, physical delivery, like serving divorce papers. 15 years of partnership, $300 million in annual contracts processing Pierce Energy's crude oil into marketable products, gone with 30 days' notice. Due to evolving regulatory compliance standards and strategic reassessment of partner relationships, the letter read. Legal speak that meant, we can't afford to be associated with you. Richard's VP of Operations tried calling Apex's CEO. Voicemail. The operations director. Voicemail. Even the account manager who'd worked their partnership for a decade wouldn't return calls. Tuesday brought the board resignations. Gerald Morrison first, then Patricia Chun, then David Brennan, his father's college roommate. All citing ethical concerns regarding corporate governance and regulatory compliance, in carefully worded letters their attorneys had obviously drafted. 3 seats empty. The exodus was trending on financial news sites by lunch. Wednesday, the legal bills arrived. Patterson and Chase, the white shoe firm that had protected Pierce Energy for 2 decades, delivered their terms through a stone-faced partner Richard barely recognized. $8 million retainer, non-refundable, due within 48 hours. Our accounts are frozen pending the federal investigation, Richard said, hearing the desperation in his own voice. Then we can't represent you, Mr. Pierce. The government has unlimited resources. We need matching capital to mount an adequate defense. They were gone by end of business. Thursday, Richard tried the political connections his family had cultivated for 3 generations. Senator Morrison, no relation to the board member, had accepted $400,000 in campaign contributions over 8 years. His chief of staff returned Richard's call with practiced regret. The senator appreciates your past support, but given the ongoing federal investigation, he feels it's inappropriate to engage at this time. Governor Patterson's office didn't even bother with excuses. Just a terse email from an assistant. The governor's calendar is fully committed. Friday morning, Riverside Capital called in their credit line. $50 million due in 90 days. The bank president, a man Richard had golfed with quarterly for 15 years, didn't take his call. By Friday afternoon, Catherine had stopped leaving the bedroom. Sandra sat in the living room scrolling through Instagram, watching her follower count drop. Brands were pulling sponsorships, partnerships evaporating, her comments section filled with hashtags. Hashtag eat the rich, hashtag karma is real. Dad, what's happening? She asked, her voice small in a way Richard had never heard. Richard looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw the architect of their destruction. 23 years old, raised in a golden cage, never told no, never taught that actions had consequences beyond what money could fix. We're being erased, he said. And the man doing it hasn't made a single threat. 7 days. That's all it took for 3 generations of wealth and power to collapse into rubble. And somewhere in Manhattan, Alex Volkov was already moving to his next target, because the Pierce family wasn't even worth remembering anymore. The conference room smelled like defeat and stale coffee. Richard Pierce sat across from federal prosecutors who looked young enough to be his children, their faces showing the particular satisfaction of junior attorneys who'd just landed a major scalp. The settlement terms covered 47 pages. Richard's attorney, a public defender now, the expensive firm long gone, had negotiated for 3 weeks. This was the best they'd get. Complete admission of liability for safety violations at offshore facilities and refinery operations, the lead prosecutor said, sliding the document forward. She was 32, Harvard Law, building a career on cases like this. Immediate shutdown of all 17 offshore platforms pending comprehensive safety overhaul. $400 million in penalties and environmental remediation costs. $400 million. More than the company's remaining liquid assets. We'll need to liquidate, Richard said, his voice flat. That's not our concern, Mr. Pierce. The admission of guilt meant everything else collapsed automatically. Insurance carriers denied coverage citing willful negligence. Remaining clients terminated contracts within hours of the announcement. Banks accelerated loan repayments. By March, Pierce Energy Solutions existed only on paper. The offshore platforms sold to Meridian Energy for $190 million, a quarter of their actual value. The pipeline infrastructure absorbed by Continental Resources in a fire sale that made financial news as a cautionary tale. The refinery contracts purchased by the same companies that had terminated partnerships months earlier, buying the carcass at bankruptcy prices. 3 generations of wealth building, gone in 10 weeks. Richard's grandfather had secured those first drilling rights in 1962, working 18-hour days on platforms in the Gulf, betting everything on offshore exploration when it was still frontier territory. His father had expanded into pipelines during the infrastructure boom of the 80s, understanding that transportation mattered as much as extraction. Richard had transformed it into a $700 million empire spanning 3 industries. Sandra obliterated it with 1 glass of ice water. The Tribeca penthouse went to auction in April. Christie's handled the sale. Furniture, art, Catherine's jewelry, everything with resale value. Richard watched strangers bid on his grandfather's desk, his father's watch collection, the Rothko that had hung in their living room for 15 years. Catherine attended wearing sunglasses inside, her hands trembling as a woman in Chanel bought her engagement ring for 60 cents on the dollar. Sandra sat in the back row, unrecognizable without the designer wardrobe and professional makeup. Her Instagram account was deactivated. The influencer partnerships had evaporated. The friends who'd filmed her pouring water on Alex Volkov had all blocked her number. The final asset sale closed in May. Pierce Energy Solutions ceased to exist as a corporate entity. The name that had meant power for 60 years was now a cautionary tale in business schools, a case study in hubris and regulatory failure. Richard signed the dissolution papers in the same conference room where he'd built deals worth hundreds of millions. The pen felt heavier than it should have. 3 generations. 10 weeks. 1 glass of water. The apartment in Astoria was 900 square feet. First floor, street-facing, where car alarms and delivery trucks provided the soundtrack to their new life. Sandra's former walk-in closet had been larger. Catherine stood in the kitchen that was barely big enough to turn around in, unpacking dishes from Target. Not Bernardod porcelain, not Wedgwood china. Melamine plates that came in sets of 12 for $39. Her hands, which once wore a Harry Winston engagement ring, were red from washing dishes without a housekeeper for the first time in 30 years. Richard found work through a former colleague who still took his calls. Barely. Strategic consulting for mid-tier energy firms that needed someone who understood corporate infrastructure, but couldn't afford top-tier advisory services. $55,000 a year. He commuted on the subway now, squeezed between strangers during rush hour, his suits from Men's Warehouse replacing the bespoke Italian tailoring. The offices were in buildings without doormen, without marble lobbies, without the markers of power he'd spent his entire life accumulating. Catherine's position came through an environmental nonprofit, the kind of organization she used to donate to for tax write-offs and social credibility. $28 an hour processing grant applications and managing volunteer schedules. Part-time, no benefits, supervised by a 26-year-old coordinator who called her Kathy, and didn't know she'd once chaired museum boards. She worked Tuesday through Thursday, 9 to 3, and cried in the bathroom during lunch breaks. Sandra's job came last. Hammond Energy Consulting needed an administrative assistant for their Midtown office. $38,000 a year answering phones, scheduling meetings, and managing calendars for executives who didn't know her name. Her manager was 28, 3 years older than Sandra, running a team of 6 with the casual authority of someone who'd earned their position through competence rather than inheritance. She explained Sandra's duties with practiced patience, showing her how to operate the multi-line phone system, where to order office supplies when executives took their coffee breaks. Sandra sat at a desk in an open floor plan with fluorescent lighting and no privacy, making $12 an hour less than her former housekeeper. At night, the 3 of them sat in the tiny living room eating takeout from containers because cooking felt like too much effort. The television was a used model Richard found on Facebook Marketplace. Catherine's diamond bracelet was gone, sold months ago to cover legal fees. Sandra's designer wardrobe had been liquidated on consignment for pennies on the dollar. The penthouse, the private jet, the Hamptons, the galas, the world where their name meant something. It felt like a fever dream now. Like it had happened to different people in a different lifetime. Outside, queens hummed with life that had never noticed their rise and didn't care about their fall. They were nobody now. Invisible. Ordinary. And somewhere in Manhattan, Alex Volkov had already forgotten they existed. The invitation arrived by messenger at Hammond Energy Consulting. Heavy cardstock, embossed lettering. Azure Restaurant, 8 p.m., table reserved under Volkov. Sandra stared at the card for 3 days before deciding to go. She took the subway to Manhattan wearing her best remaining outfit, a Zara dress that cost what her former nail appointments used to. The maitre d' recognized her immediately, something flickering across his face that might have been pity. Alex Volkov sat at the same corner table, reading the same way he had 10 months ago. He looked up when she approached, gestured to the empty chair. "Sit." Sandra sat. Her hands trembled in her lap. "You look different," Alex said, studying her with those same calm eyes that had memorized her face while water dripped from his hair. "Humbler. You destroyed my family." "No." He poured 2 glasses of water from the pitcher on the table. Ice clinked against crystal. "I stopped protecting your family. There's a difference." He slid 1 glass toward her. Sandra stared at it like it might explode. "Every permit your father needed to operate," Alex continued, his voice measured and quiet. "Every regulatory approval that came through faster than it should have, every environmental inspection that overlooked minor violations, every union negotiation that settled favorably. Those didn't happen because Pierce Energy was special. They happened because I made them happen." Sandra's throat tightened. "Your mother's charity boards, the social connections that opened doors, the political relationships that smoothed over complications. I maintained those networks. Not for you, for the system. Because energy infrastructure requires cooperation, and cooperation requires trust." He took a sip of water. You poured water on me like I was nothing, like I was furniture. Entertainment for your friends' Instagram stories. I didn't know. Exactly. Alex leaned forward. You didn't know because you never bothered to learn. You thought power was money, status, followers, family name. You never understood that power is relationships. Every permit clerk, every regulator, every union boss, every infrastructure operator your father's business depended on. Those were relationships that required respect, maintenance, care. I held those threads together. And when you treated me like nothing, I let them go. Sandra felt tears burning behind her eyes. I didn't plant violations or fabricate evidence, Alex said. I simply stopped protecting your family from the consequences of who you really were. A company built on favors rather than foundations. Wealth built on connections you took for granted. Power you never earned. He stood, placed cash on the table. The lesson isn't about revenge, Sandra. It's about understanding that every person you dismiss holds threads you can't see. And one pull can unravel everything. Alex Volkov walked toward the exit. Leaving Sandra alone with a glass of water she couldn't bring herself to touch. 10 months ago, she'd poured water on a stranger. Tonight, she finally understood what that stranger had taken away. Not her family's business, but the illusion that it had ever been truly theirs.